When it comes to the ongoing wave of migrant rape and sexual assault in Europe, the people I feel most sorry for are the refugee-friendly progressive feminists, because when they get raped, they won't even know who to blame without being a racist. What am I saying? Of course they will. They'll blame all men, as usual, while telling everybody else not to generalize. I hadn't intended to talk about this subject again for a while, but it's International Women's Day, so how could I resist? You may know that a couple of my recent videos on this subject have been censored by YouTube because it seems that the progressive feminists at YouTube really don't like to be ridiculed, which is good to know. Progressive feminism differs from real feminism, of course, in that it's a lot more about appearance and public posture than it is about substance. It certainly has nothing to do with the welfare of women and everything to do with the petty bigotries and personal neuroses of the stupid progressive feminists. All other women, especially women who are oppressed by other cultures, if you'll pardon the euphemism, can go hang themselves, because progressive feminism subscribes to a toxic identity grievance hierarchy that puts black and brown-skinned men above all women. White men, of course, are right at the bottom, especially white heterosexual men, because they're responsible for all the bad things in the world and there's nothing good to be said about them, which is why you'll find that progressive feminists will often have more of a problem with white men who don't rape than they do with black or brown men who do. The black and brown rapists are clearly driven to it by white racism. We shouldn't demonize and otherize people from disadvantaged backgrounds just because they happen to be violent rapists, when we could be putting the blame where it really belongs, on white men and their racism. Isn't that right, girls? Now, obviously, to those of us outside the progressive bubble, that sounds totally idiotic. But we have to try and understand the kind of pressure these women are under from the other progressive dimwits around them, especially in a place like Google, which is notoriously a safe space environment. And this means, of course, that many of its employees are certifiably insane. And they know better than anyone the kind of hysterical reaction they'll be faced with if they ever step out of line, because they hear it whenever they open their mouths and they see it whenever they look in the mirror, and they know that if they were ever crazy enough to unequivocally condemn a brown-skinned rapist, they would immediately be smeared as a racist by a rabid mob of empty-headed, sloganeering bimbos just like themselves. And that's what they fear more than anything, because they're too stupid to know any better. I do hope that doesn't offend. Meanwhile, Europe is being invaded by a violent third world Muslim rape culture. Have I mentioned this before? Well, let me mention it again, just for International Women's Day. If the invasion is allowed to continue, and thanks to our politicians, many of them female, it looks as if it will, rape is going to evolve in Europe from a disgusting, horrific crime to an unfortunate cultural difference. And women are going to learn, often the hard way, to keep themselves covered and to spend less time in the public space. And this is the society that we will leave to our grandchildren. We can already see it taking shape. A society significantly less safe and significantly less free for women than the society that we were lucky enough to be born into. We, of the most pampered generation in human history. We've never had to defend anything or fight for anything. Consequently, we don't know the value of anything, which is why we're such a pushover. So, you women in Europe need to wake up to the imminent threat you face. Because it's clear now that the people in Europe who call themselves men are not going to help you. If you don't wake up now and start voting, yes, voting seriously against the politicians who are enabling this invasion, your daughters and granddaughters will pay a very heavy price indeed. And it would be so wonderful if you women at Google could help them in that by just getting out of the way. We're not asking you girls to leave your safe space, because you'd be like a crab without a shell. We understand that. But if you could just not hinder the people who are trying to make the difference that you could be making, it would be really great. And if any of you are curious about what Europe is inflicting on its female population, just visit a Muslim country, walk down the street in a short skirt and see for yourself. But a little tip, if you do happen to get raped by one or more of the locals, Whatever you do, don't report it to the police, or you'll be the criminal, and you might even get raped again. It's a cultural difference, and here in the progressive West, you know, we love to celebrate difference, and what could be more different than getting punished for being raped? Plus, learning about other cultures broadens the mind, so it's actually quite educational. It all depends how you look at it, as it always does when everything is relative. After all, who are we in privileged Europe to tell disadvantaged third world men that they shouldn't abuse and rape women if that's their culture? And if they want to come here to Europe illegally in unsustainably massive numbers and rape women and children here, what moral right do we have to object, all cultures being equal and all? If we're arrogant enough to try and educate them out of it, they might become traumatized, marginalized, and vulnerable. No, it's clearly up to you women in Europe to take some responsibility here and keep yourselves hidden if you don't want to be raped. It's not as if you don't know what's coming by now, unless you've been living in a cave. Look at the countries these people are coming from. The very worst countries on earth for women, where thousands of women and girls are forced into violent marriages and lives of misery every day, including International Women's Day, and where they have no rights worthy of the name. And the men, if you can call them that, who are doing it to them, are being allowed to flood into Europe en masse and to bring that vile mentality here completely unfiltered and unchallenged. What did anyone think was going to happen? Well, it is happening again and again. And as this invasion is allowed to continue, it will get worse and worse and worse until we are faced with a crime against humanity. When you purposely flood an emancipated liberal society like ours with overwhelming numbers of fighting-age men from a violent, misogynistic rape culture, you don't need to be a genius to predict what will happen. But you do need to be a special kind of rotten in the head to pretend that it won't happen when you know it will. Morally, it's on a par with leaving a baby alone with a vicious dog. You've got no excuse. And you've got less than no excuse for censoring information about it if you call yourself a feminist. Peace. And happy International Women's Day to everyone, but especially to the progressive bimbos, male and female, at Google and YouTube.